Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mark Groves podcast. I'm so excited for today's episode. We have one of the most renowned teachers in understanding human behavior and exploring trauma.
F this. I didn't become a therapist to be helpful to people. I'm not that altruistic. It was like, I need to understand why I can't human. Like, why is my brain not braining like all these normal people that seem to go to sleep, wake up, eat food, and like do life? I did not get it.
And what is trauma? And is that word overused? And all those types of things. We're going to dive deep into human behavior and how trauma shapes us individually, how it impacts our families, how it impacts cultures, etc. Britt Frank is a neuropsychotherapist. She's the author of the book, The Science of Stuck, which is an incredible book. And the previous episode I've done with her was on that book. She is hilarious. Like, I just can't say that enough, but you're going to hear her life story and how it shaped her and why she wanted to dive deep into understanding trauma and how that helped her and, of course, may help you. So if you're listening to this, you might not be yet subscribed and you do not want to miss any upcoming episodes because they are bangers. And if you miss them and those episodes could change your life, you're going to be sad about that. So make sure you hit subscribe. If you're watching this video, hit like, share it with people that you think it resonates with. And by subscribing to the podcast, you help support the podcast as well, which would make me extremely elated. And I like feeling elated. So with that said, here is, oh my gosh, such an incredible episode. One of my favorite humans, incredibly thoughtful, considerate, compassionate, and open and truth-telling wizard, Britt Frank. Let's go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mark Groves podcast. Today I am joined by returning guest, Britt Frank. What's up?
It's good to see you again.
My God, it's so good to see you. And last time you came on the pod, we talked about your book, The Science of Stuck. And for those of you who have not listened to that episode, it did exceptionally well because it was exceptional. And Britt's book, fantastic. I know you got another one that you're in the midst of. It's
another inflammatory comment on we all have multiple personalities. There's nothing pathological about that. Here's how to help everyone in your head get along. So I'm prepping for the onslaught of angry DMs with that one.
Yeah, how to get all the... Well, we had Sarah Baldwin on who talks about the nervous system, and she was talking about how each part within us actually has a different vagal tone, which I was like, what?
It makes sense.
It's incredible. And it made me think of how the time imprint of whatever part is sort of fragmented then has the memory of the nervous system. So does the memory live in the brain or the nervous system?
Yes.
Both?
All of the above.
Really?
It's wild too, because if we talk, people who talk about inner child and parts work don't necessarily have the somatic nervous system training. And the people who have the somatic nervous system training aren't always trained in parts work. But your inner child has a different somatic experience of the world. So how your physiology experiences the world will change moment to moment depending on which part is dominant. IFS is internal family systems. Thank you, Inside Out 2 screenwriters, for normalizing multiplicity.
And they have a new one that just came out. I haven't watched
good.
it. Is it good?
It's so good.
I heard it's like even better than the first.
It's so like
better.
They did it well. Like they talked to some therapists who have this training. It is excellently done.
That's cool. The first one I always found the mopey little
It was sad.
Was annoying, right? Yeah.
Big bunk.
Yeah. Oh my God, my life is so bad.
Sadness. No, this one's great.
Which is like obviously relevant. I just was like, I get annoyed by that.
By sadness?
Yeah, I get annoyed by sadness. The preventative movement of sadness. I think it's because I didn't know the value of it when I first watched that. But I also can see how people get stuck in that victimized space and how it's like, man, just walk through the door, just go. But of course, it's not. Insert your book, The Science of Stuck, and then it contextualizes it. So when someone's in a conflict and let's say a romantic partner, because that's probably where we're going to see it the most once we're out of our childhood, is that what you're talking about, how we can, the nervous system, the memory, the experience of the child, when we get triggered, that's the activation of the part?
That's the activation. But what we don't talk about enough is that we talk about attachment. Attachment is so trendy right now. Like I've seen merch, anxious avoidant, and I'm disorganized. But every complex system is made of multiple parts. Like your body, you have one body, but every part, cell, organ, and tissue has a different need, has a different expression, has a different makeup. When you're in a relationship, it's not two people, it's like 30. And so if I'm getting triggered by my partner, it's
shit. Things got complicated.
It's a big crew. It is a crew. Like 2 people in bed or like 30 people in bed, which is why I like separate bedrooms.
So it's like an orgy.
Big time.
But kind of.
You took it there. And yes.
I had to.
Yes.
I had 30 people in bed. I mean, that's a lot of organization.
It is, but it makes sense because in conflict, everyone knows the feeling of you are no longer my partner. You are my enemy and I will destroy you and everything you stand for. It's like, that's because another part of you is taken over, largely a fight flight part. But when we understand that we're multiply oriented in our personalities, conflict is easier because I don't need to defend my position to the death. It's like part of me has this feeling. Oh, part of me has that feeling. And we all use the language. Part of me knows I should go to the gym and not smoke meth. And then this other part of me this is me sitting in a really gross bathroom with a broken light bulb in my hands. It's like we all are so disconnected from our inherent multiplicity, which is why this very black and white thinking has largely, I think, pervaded.
I think for people who haven't listened to the first episode and maybe don't have a background on what brought you here to like being so fascinated by, for example, like functional freeze, being so fascinated by parts, and being able to say, that's me. I was in a dirty bathroom with a broken light bulb. Okay, past Britt, walk us back the path that led you to be so fascinated and so good at translating all those experiences and the experiences that people have and how to move through where we might feel like it's inevitable. How will I ever be different? How will I ever change when it seems so insurmountable?
It seemed so insurmountable to me because I didn't have some very basic information. Like it's horrifying to me now as a licensed clinician, how we are inundated with information, not all of which is accurate, not all of which is helpful. So I grew up in just an absolute chaotic environment. Boundaries were not a word. Like sense of self, feelings. The only feelings that were really allowed were anger and anxiety. Like those were fine. But there was no discussion of here's how to human, here's how bodies change, here's how minds change. And a lot of trauma, a lot of childhood trauma shenanigans. And so when I hit puberty and then into college and after, I got into crazy making relationships, domestic violence situations, drug addiction, eating disorders, OCD. Like my list of DSM diagnoses was not short.
You were like playing whack-a-mole with or collecting like
turn the page. This is my collection of diagnoses. But what I didn't know then was all of that was trauma because no one used that word. I didn't even hear that word until I was almost 30. Like a therapist said to me, like, you understand that you've got some trauma. I'm like, no, I don't. I was never in a war. I was never in these situations and I didn't understand any of it. So I'm like, F this. I didn't become a therapist to be helpful to people. I'm not that altruistic. It was like, I need to understand why I can't human. Like, why is my brain not braining like all these normal people that seem to go to sleep, wake up, eat food, and like do life? I did not get it. And in learning it, I'm like, oh, this stuff is not that complicated. Life is complicated.
Yeah.
But the stuff that we need to know to make sense of the insanity, like people are not insane, but systems are, is not that complicated. So my passion is like, let's demystify and de-academic, blah, 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 all of this shit so we can make it make sense so we can feel better and do things better for our lives.
So when you went through, like, where did you, in your story, did you find yourself with the therapist saying, hey, you get, like, you've had some shit, and you're like, what? So I'm curious, where was that in your story?
I've never said this publicly, but because no one's ever asked.
Reveal.
That therapist was, this is a big reveal. A religious cult that I was in.
That was the religious therapist?
That was a cult's religious therapist who was the first person who said to me, you know, you're not actually crazy. That's not what's happening here. And there's no such thing as crazy. Like that's a pejorative that we use to label people, but it's not a biological reality. She's like, you're not crazy. This is trauma. And that seed was like, that's why even I'm not pro cults, but that seed of sanity was planted in the midst of my cult madness.
Do you think like it's ironic to me that a therapist is within a cult and then like obviously participating in the ideology of the cult, but then also speaking to basically the pathology of what makes you capturable by a cult? Do you know what I'm saying?
Isn't that so meta?
Yeah, it's like fucked up. It's like there's so many dimensions of human interacting there, but also it's like, oh, if the person in the cult is revealing that I have trauma, then the cult can't be an issue. It's actually a savior on some level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And strangely, that seed that got planted in that moment by that cult therapist was what opened up the trail that led me out and to doing the work I now do. So yay, thank you.
Thank you, cult therapist.
Thank you. She has a very special place in my heart.
She's still practicing in the in the cult? Oh my gosh. Well, I think that like, so you were in a cult till you were how old?
It was on and off from 20, we'll say 20s. Mm-hmm.
So you left the cult and entered meth.
Very quickly in, very quickly out. And then I went to grad school mid-30s and started my practice. And I'm 44 now. So.
It's such an incredible journey. Like, and I don't think anyone would have guessed that you go from like drugs, domestic, all the things to cult.
Yeah.
But in the cult, there was domestic challenges, right?
Sure. Most cults have a lot of problems with violence and very suboptimized sexual teachings that result in very unhealthy relational power differentials and dynamics. So what got me into cult life was my personal trauma. And the cult was a really safe haven until it wasn't. And then people were like, how'd you get out? I'm like, drugs.
They got me out.
They got me out.
Psychedelics?
No, meth.
No, that's meth. So you left and did meth or did meth and left?
I left and did meth.
For how long?
Not very, but long enough to get sucked into a very dark place, having seen things and done things that give me both horror at the human condition and incredible compassion for our capacity.
Yeah, when I look at, we were speaking before we hit record just about where we are, Spokane, but being from Vancouver for a while, I lived there, just seeing the level of street drug use and to me, it's like, it's so sad because it's so indicative of, I always think of Gabor Mate's like the wrong questions, why the addiction, the right questions, why the pain. And I just see like we have so much pain going on. And yet, you and I have spoken offline about this, but it's like, despite more therapeutic access, more personal growth access, more self-reflective access than ever in human history, which is wild to consider. Like I think about going through a breakup in my, when I was like 12 or 13. And I mean, we only dated for a week. There should not have been, there was a level of devastation that was not necessarily equated to the experience. But there was nowhere to go. Like there was no place for me to seek some form of resolution or like understand my feelings because there was not courses in school. There was, my mom and dad would speak to me, but I about things, especially my father would. But I think in some ways it was like something I just held in. If I brought it to my dad or my mom, they would have held it, but I don't know why I didn't. But I also look now and I'm like, wow, we have so much access to so much information. And yet we are, from what I could see, curious your thoughts on it. COVID for sure impacted and further amplified an already greatest mental health crisis of our time, which now I would imagine has been sort of like 3 or 4x'd. What do you think?
That's fair. And I agree with you. Like, despite the plethora of information, we're unhappy, we're anxious, we're sick, we're unwell. And part of that problem, I think, is because a lot of the information coming out of the mental health world is not given with the caveat that mental health providers, licensed mental health providers, are not all required. Most are not to have any training in the brain or to have any training in trauma whatsoever. So like I learned what I now know about trauma as a subspecialty through years of optional and very expensive education that I opted into. But I can sit here and diagnose you with bipolar, with borderline, with major depression, with anything, never having once been trained in the mechanisms of the brain and never having once been told, you need to consider context, environment, nuance, and the impact of trauma. But when mental health providers are not required to be in therapy or study trauma, and then they're disseminating information, that's going to create a disconnect. So that's part of the problem. The other part is the impulse to label as a self-soothing mechanism, which I get. I joined a cult. I was so desperate for a label. I'm like, who am I? Tell me what to read, what to wear, what to eat, I do this and I'm good. Labels are a great starting point.
Yeah.
But we've taken labels not as a starting place, but as endgame. This is who I am. This is how I function. This is what I do. And so both the lack of accurate information coupled with the impulse to label as a self-soothing mechanism, it's not the only problem, but like shenanigans with both of those en masse.
Yeah, because it's a while, there's no regulation in that space. And, this is me saying that as a coach with there's no regulation,
right?
But I think like I want to be mindful that I'm not speaking from like a righteous or hierarchical place, but I always found a great responsibility in needing to understand and having a very deep knowledge and toolkit to be able to walk someone through something. And if I didn't have it, I'm not walking,
right?
Like I'm referring or I'm, whatever it might be. And so it's for sure like mental health providers, but also anyone in that sort of therapeutic coaching space, there's a lot of people talking about a lot of things that are incredibly valuable and they're dialed and they're all, so this is not all, it's all bad.
Right.
There's obviously incredible teachings in all these spaces. But what you're saying about, how this is, because social media has now sort of like amplified and having now left social media, when I look at it or I experience something within it, especially right before I left, I was starting to really notice just how just flooded we are with all these conversations. And then what does that do inherently to ourselves when we're always thinking that we're a problem that needs to be solved? And when I look, the beautiful thing about having any life circumstance that you're fucked up, something fucked up happens, is that you then, now you can be like, I'm fucked up. Here's what happened. How do I get help? And then you're brought to wherever the algorithm brings you, not necessarily the best place, but the place the algorithm brings you. And then you're walked ideally through that. But what I see as being a challenge is what brings you to therapeutic personal growth spaces is there's a problem that I'm having or I am, and I need to solve it. But at some point, the sort of like baseline reconstructing the foundation is done. And then you're no longer quote unquote a problem, although I would say you never were. It's just the self-identity, probably sourced from your childhood, needs to change to I'm good. I have things I need to learn to become better, just to improve. And so the orientation doesn't come from a place of lack. It comes from a place of expansion. Does that make sense?
It does. And it's really tricky too, because again, I'm not here to rail against therapists because I didn't know until I knew. Like a therapist who went to school and was trained in here's pathology and here's what's wrong with people are told these are the questions you ask and these are the diagnoses that you give people. And like they're not told, just so you know, there are limitations to what we're giving you and there's limitations to what we're teaching you. And so this people are broken must be fixed. People are symptomatic and symptoms are a sign of disorder. But often what we call disorder or disease is our brains doing what brains were fucking designed to do, which is keep us alive. That doesn't justify all bad behavior.
Right.
But
it does contextualize it.
It contextualizes it. And it does change. Like when I look back, I'm not proud of all of my choices and all my behaviors, but they make sense. And feeling completely disconnected and feeling broken are a large driver of what we're seeing as like it's such a cycle, right? If you know that there's nothing wrong with you, now, it's both yay, nothing's wrong with me, and oh no, now I have some ownership and accountability. If it's not, this is who I am, then I have some choices to make to the degree I have them.
Yeah, it also like, how do you connect when I think in the world today, especially with the amplification through social media, how do you connect with other people if you're not connecting from wounds, if you're not connecting from victimization?
Yes.
Which like I look at the hierarchy that is now framed like, I was reading the book Canceling the American Mind, and they were talking about when you actually get to the baseline of every intersection of who you're not supposed to listen to, which is like white guy, straight, right? So you get to the intersections of like race, gender, name the LGBTQ, like going through all these different spaces. Like 0.8% of the population is allowed to have an opinion. which is pretty fucking wild. And social media, I think, has now, this is my experience of it, is that people are so quick to provide a position on something for fear that they will be called bad, complicit, all the different names. But if the opinion they then get the courage to share is not aligned, they get attacked and canceled. So there's no psychological safety. There's no somatic safety. There's no safety unless it's in alignment with what I have seen, and this is not obviously always true, but what I have seen are more what might be framed, and I'll just speak to this because it's easier from an archetypal perspective, as more like left-wing mainstream views, which are also reiterated by the media, which are also amplified by algorithms. Again, nothing wrong with, I'm not saying they're bad. It's just that the inability to discuss them or oppose them because you get annihilated, it creates this space where like an idea is not held by the majority if the opposition of it is not allowed. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's not
incredibly well said.
When criticism is not allowed.
Right.
But yet we have these, like, I would say in their extremes, they become bad ideas when they're not open to being shaped by diverse thought. And so then you have these bad ideas that actually cause harm, but they're framed in causing good.
Yes.
That's a big boatload of shit. So tell me, what do you think about all that?
Agree is the short answer. And I'll speak with trauma specifically because that's my area. We went from nothing is trauma, everything is psychopathology, and we have wildly overshot now to everything is trauma. Every trigger must be soothed and prevented. Every pain point must be insulated, and we can't have any discomfort whatsoever. And both sides are lacking in nuance.
Yeah.
Both sides are lacking in context. But if you point that out from the center, then you're canceled.
You're usually called right-wing, which is the irony.
Which is very strange.
It really is. Because there's like, I have never, I mean, in my experience of myself and the people I've been around, especially because I'm in the space I'm in, I'm definitely always hanging out with more like what might be considered like libertarian thinkers. But in the last 4 years, I've seen the fragility of that space significantly. And where, again, I'm self-reporting, so there's a bias. Although I'd be curious to hear people's perspective who are not on the far left, because I've already heard theirs lots, is I have not changed the way I orient things. I'm just still curious, and I'm still, there are obviously, I'm human, so I like hold biases about everything. And I'm probably more closed-minded than I like to perceive myself as. But I look at things like what you're saying, which is the diagnosis of everything is big T, trauma, or everything is trauma. And if everything is trauma, then everyone's a victim, not just of life, of life's experiences, but also everyone's a narcissist.
Yes.
Which that is like, which I think that mild avoidance is often coded as narcissism.
Lots of things are coded as narcissism. And this is where this very black and white, this is who I am, this is how I orient, this is my label, totally annihilates the reality of our parts. Like I have many different, there's no flexibility and there's no curiosity, because in this very unsafe to question or ask or dialogue or debate, that totally eradicates curiosity. So then if we're going in, if I know that I have a part of me that's super narky and narcissistic, and I have a part of me that's super codependent, and I have a part of me that's a total asshole, and I have a part of me that's really kind, then there's room for debate and nuance, because I'm not going to go into a nervous system fight response at the idea that my identity is now challenged. I've diversified my psyche enough so that it can withstand criticism. Like if you were to say to me, you know, Britt, you're kind of an ass, I could say that's probably a little bit true. And because I'm not invested wholly in that identity and that label, I can have a dialogue. But when we are mono-minded, we have one identity, one primary label, there's no room. Like then I implode under the microscope. So
yeah, it's like whenever you have that level of homogeneity, it's like systems are complex, people are complex. And so if I hear you correctly, when you orient yourself with rigidity, but that rigidity almost being a diagnosed rigidity or like a labeled rigidity or a social media TikTok oriented perspective of yourself, then you don't have the complexity within you that you orient to with compassion and curiosity, then how could you ever be open to someone else's perspective that might make that fragile or just be different?
Exactly. And if you think of the environment, again, this makes sense if you look to nature, like biodiversity, a large array of flora and animals. Like I don't like mosquitoes, but I get why they're important. And I don't like being stung by bees, but without bees, like everything dies.
Right.
Our psyches without a diverse array of identities and ideologies and nuances to choose from, our internal ecosystem collapses under even the slightest questioning, criticism, or anything. And so we're not told, hey, we need to actually diversify our own psyche first before we start going out into the world. And like, I was given the diagnostic label of borderline personality disorder, which is like one of the stigmatized, like, oh no, she's borderline, it's forever. But I have since learned that it's not that my one personality is disordered. It's that in the multiplicity in my mind, nobody was getting along. And I didn't know that I was made of multiple aspects. So I just felt crazy. And
so they're in conflict with one another.
They're all in conflict. Yeah. I'm like, picture a boardroom where all of the executives are yelling at each other. Yeah. Like that was my brain on fire all of the time. But I was disorganized attachment. I was BPD. This is my diagnosis. It's like, okay, that's a great starting point.
Right.
But now what? Now I need to understand that it's complex inside, and just like nature, if we're not complex and diversified in our psyche without identifying in one label and being curious. Like I was canceled by my 12-step recovery community when I no longer identified as an addict. Like I don't like again, 12-step people, do your thing. I love the 12 steps. They saved my life. But I no longer choose to identify as an addict because I'm too diverse. Parts of me are really addicted to drugs and I have to do a lot of things to manage them.
Same.
But when you no longer identify as an addict, you are no longer welcome in certain rooms.
Isn't that so fascinating? It really translates a lot to like if you do not fully agree with any ideology, like you see that in the trans community, that when someone transitions, if they detransition, they are then often cast out, even though that's the place where they, for a lot of reasons, found membership. And so it's like any of these, if you immediately, they become cults, like communities that don't allow questions are cults. Communities that don't allow curiosity are cults. And I think because I know I'm prone to being captured by ideologies. I can always tell because I start to get really amplified if I'm captured, right? Which I've been there. Yeah. There's a podcast documentation of my meltdowns and my rebirths. But I know I'm prone to that. And I think like when I look at what makes someone easily captured is the belief they can't be. And so when you look at these ideologies or these positions that are happening on like mainstream spaces, it's like how convenient that the moment you're critical of it, you're not good, you're immoral, you're something. And I just know no healthy relationship is formed from a lack of discussion.
Which is true with the relationship with ourselves and our romantic partners and the community at large. And the shunning cult thing happens in every community that clusters around a cause or a label or an identifier or something. And again, it's good. A lot of it is well-intentioned. It's like, I want to seek support. When I stopped identifying as a disordered personality, I was shunned by that community too, because then I was being ableist.
What? So when you actually got into a better space of health, you are now ableist.
Right.
Because you didn't have the identity anymore.
I refuse to say I am an addict. I am personality disordered. That doesn't mean I was healthy or better. I'm still a fucking wreck. But like, I understand the complexity.
You're not trapped.
I'm not trapped. And I want to ask questions about these things. But there's merch and songs and community meetings and parties, and people bring you food if you identify according to the group's norms and rules and systems. And if you dare question them, and it's true with fitness, it's true with health. Like if you're in certain health circles.
Diet,
exactly. The shunning impacts us on such a fundamental evolutionary level. It's like shunning equals death. So of course we're going to be prone to being captured. All of us.
I know in having like gone to AA meetings with a family member, I was like, man, this is like TED Talks. This is great. And I also, one of the steps that I just never could get around, and I don't drink, And that was just like a choice I made one day, because I used to think that drinking in college and blacking out was just normal. Time traveling is what we called it, but it's not. And I just, it's so normalized as part of our culture. Just like I had Laura McCown on, she talked about how like mommy wine life is just normalized.
Yes.
It's marketed. So it's like this idea that we need alcohol to get through, and we use alcohol to connect. But one thing I never could get around was this idea that like I have a disease and I'm a victim of the disease. Like I have to surrender to the disease. And I was like, well, that sounds like you then can't ever leave that. Like this idea that if it's not curable, then even though I'm like, man, I know not that people should go back to drinking, but I mean like what it was at the basis of the drinking is really the thing that needs to be confronted.
Right. And you can't say that, right? In a 12-step room.
And you need to find God in it too. That's the other, it's very religiously, which all good, go God.
Do your thing.
I'm like, it becomes like a trap.
And I said this in the book. There's so many models. We're talking about addiction, which is like rampant in all areas, not just drugs and alcohol. Is the disease model sometimes true for some people? Sure. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and be like, it's never a disease because it's just as anti-nuanced.
Sure.
But is it a disease for every single person and a 25-year-old with no history of anything catastrophic and a healthy-ish enough family gets prescribed opiates for a knee injury, and now without being told their addictive properties, without being given any information, now finds himself in a $300 a day heroin habit? Is that a disease? So I got into meth and eating disorders and drugs and crazy making relationships sort of mixed in with the religious madness. The religious madness took the edge off of all of that for a few years. And then I started doing drugs again. And so drugs got me in, drugs got me out of cult life.
Wow. Who knew that a drug would get us in and out? But a lot of drugs have got a lot of people out of a lot of things, but they've also, not everyone gets out.
Not everyone gets out. And I would not recommend drugs as the pathway to enlightenment. But for me, crystal meth brought me so far down into the absolute abyss of my own shits. It was no longer an option to justify, minimize, excuse, or blame. There was nothing left.
Like you found the bottom.
I found the end of the road. I was like, oh, this is me. No one's coming to rescue me. There's nobody to blame. I am sitting here because I am sitting here, and the only person that's going to get me out is me.
Wow. It's like such a moment of the end of the wound, seeking someone to finally see, finally choose, finally. And then the path is starting to be created of like, and that's like, I share this quote a lot from Alan Watts where he said, like, once you wake up to conscious choice, you become the God you were taught to praise. And I know that can, obviously, to some people, they're like, you're not God. And choice makes you a God of your own life, which is ultimately like the freedom from everything is sovereignty, is like choice, discernment.
Which is incredibly disruptive to a lot of people, myself included. If this is just who I am, if I am a diseased addict and a personality disordered person, then there's nothing I need to do except lean into this identity as my new reality. When I was not a cult therapist, by a different therapist, confronted with hey, like not everyone has choices. You do. Like you are not in a systemic oppression situation. You're not in a war-torn country. Like Britt, you have choices to make. I was like, fuck no, I'm a victim. I didn't understand the difference between victim and victimized. Like objectively, yes, being molested is being victimized, whatever. But that does not mean now I am doomed to be a victim. Is the story I attached to the victimization. When we attach a story of identity to a victimization, that becomes victim mentality. But I'm also big on you don't have to blame a victim to still own your life.
Yeah, that real thin line that you have to dance with nuance of if you talk about someone staying in the mopey character and inside out, that there is somehow a negation of the experience of being a victim.
Right.
When you say like, hey, let's choose your life. Like choose your fucking life. And it's like, you don't know what I've been through. You're right, I don't. And you can stay in that story, or it could be the reason or the moment everything changed.
Exactly. Which is why, and that's a really inflammatory thing you just said, which I agree with, which is why I prefer the question, what are my choices always and I don't like always, but I'll say always as opposed to what's wrong with me or what's my excuse. Not everyone has the same 24 hours. Not everyone has the same choice points, but most people, I should say, have choices. So you might not have the choice to go to a fancy insurance only rehab, but what are your choices? Because as soon as you start connecting with your capacity for choice, recovery and autonomy and agency get restored.
Also, I'd argue that the idea that you should have a different choice just perpetuates more suffering and victimization.
Yeah, I don't like my choices.
Right. Like, but what's on the table?
Yes.
Because as soon as you start to go, well, it's not, I'm looking 5 steps down. 5 steps down don't look good, but you're not dealing with step 1. And so it's like more of that self-sabotage, more of the stuck.
Right.
Right. Which is like, oh, I don't have the capacity to hold lots of change, so I focus on that. But I do have the capacity to, I was thinking a lot about this, like if you're just 1 degree off in your life, in 10 years, that's thousands of degrees off. But if 1 degree a day, but if you start to course correct 1 degree, that's not a lot. 1% better every day at the end of the year is 365%.
But that's not social media worthy. That's not sexy. No one wants to broadcast. No one's getting validation and 10,000 likes for making such microscopic level shifts. But that is where things change. That is where, from a nervous system point of view, you need to make changes that small so you don't trigger the internal alarm, because our brains don't necessarily want success, love, and happiness. They want don't die, don't get eaten by a tiger, conserve energy, go on autopilot. And again, that's where these labels and ideologies really appeal to our brain's wiring. It's like, oh, I don't have to think. I can just do this stuff because and I can say it from my own experience, consciously cultivating a personality or a set of personalities is a lot of work.
Yeah.
The alternative is shitty, but it is a ton of work, which is why when you deviate from a group's norm, it's often the case that you're cast out because it's very threatening to people who then are now confronted with choice points of their own.
Yeah. So when you actually choose to be curious and challenge a different perspective, you now are showing a path or possibility that they are not walking.
Possibility is and again, I'm not pointing fingers. I'm pointing fingers at myself. Possibility, which sounds so wonderful and love and light, possibility is very, very upsetting if you're accustomed to a certain set of relationship norms and customs and rituals. Like every behavior from hardcore addiction to religion to fitness to diet is steeped in rituals. And taking my rituals away was like taking candy from a baby. I'm like, don't take my stuff.
The rituals are like predictive things you can rely on every day. Just like, oh, if I can rely on my community where we have this shared wound, then who am I without it anymore?
Yes.
And that's like, man, if we all started to orient to each other from a place of wellness instead of wounding, then now we have a different society. And I was listening to Michael Mead recently, and he was talking about how a culture doesn't shift through an epiphany in the culture. It shifts through each individual changing because we compose culture. Right. So the way to change culture is to change yourself. And it's like, we don't live in a society that celebrates radical responsibility. If anything, like self-responsibility and self-governing and all that kind of stuff tends to sit more on the conservative arm politically, right? And then there's a thought that if I move into that, that's an abandonment of collectivism.
Right.
But of course, it's not these simple, like it's either this or this, it's both. Because healthy relating is both having an individual and being part of a system.
Right.
And so the more you thrive as an individual, the more the system thrives.
In theory.
In theory, yeah. Or the system is invited to thrive or melt.
Exactly.
Right. Because it can't hold, which we seem to be collectively. It seems like we're in that space. Which
is true. And then again, not to rant against the DSM, I understand why we need it because it gives people access to insurance coverage and services that otherwise would not be accessible. Like, I get its utility. However, there's only 5 versions of it. Like, imagine if you were on the 5th version of your phone. It's like this thing that
wouldn't even work anymore.
It would. I mean, this is the Bible of mental health disorder. This is the gold standard of what's wrong with you. There's only been 5 versions of it, and it's largely political. It's not necessarily like relevant to everybody, and it doesn't consider trauma whatsoever, which is why I'd rather us be over indexed on the trauma conversation than where we were. But we go by these metrics. We believe expert, and I'm considered an expert, but I didn't know this until I knew it. I'm like, I've been causing harm by not knowing. I can't diagnose somebody safely and skillfully without also telling them the limitations to my training. Social media doesn't require disclaimers, neither do private practitioners or mental health providers. And I've worked in patient psych, I've worked drug rehab, I've worked with children. Never once outside of my specialized training was I told, hey, there's some limits here. So as you're working with these people, you may want to tell them that you're not actually trained in the brain. So this diagnosis is probably best as a guideline, not as this is your identity.
Like it's a framework that's allowing us to understand a pattern of your behaviors, but you are not the identity, you're the patterns.
Exactly.
But you're not the patterns, they're just behaviors, so we could change behaviors.
Exactly.
Yeah, depersonalizes it. I could see how, you've had a fucked up bunch of relationships. All of a sudden someone goes, oh, you have an anxiety disorder, or you have BPD, or you have, and then you're like,
yes, that's
like, it's not me. My fucked upness is organized in this way. Oh, now I have relief. And, oh, there's a path out. It's these drugs, or it's this path, but you'll always be.
Right.
That's so scary to me, because that's the trap of every autoimmune disease. That's the trap of every illness. And we have to speak about the complex systems that benefit from staying in it. Like if I require chronic help in a health issue, then I'm always part of a system that profits from me.
Right. And who's making the money off of the diagnosis, the disorder, the ailment, the affliction, which is why the strengths-based is sort of a trend in the social work field, which yay. I mean, it's been around for a minute, but we don't use strengths-based language when we talk, especially about things like anxiety and depression, which are, I have it, this is who I am, without considering that both anxiety and depression are functional, and they're like smoke alarms. Like the smoke alarm is not your problem. The symptom that you think is the problem is not. It's a signal. Right. And symptoms are storytellers. But as a culture and as people, we're taught shove it down. If it's uncomfortable, discomfort equals disease. Discomfort equals pathology. And that's not true. Cocaine feels great. Leg day feels bad. But like clearly one is not healthier than the other.
Right. It's so simple too when you think about it. But that is not a common perspective, that the smoke alarm is your symptom. And I remember talking to a friend who was going away to Europe for school. This was years ago. And they were like, man, I have anxiety. And we were in front of her aunt at the time. And her aunt said, oh, yeah, but like anxiety runs in your family. And I was like, first, I can't not. So I was like, first off, anxiety doesn't run in. It's not a chemical imbalance inherited. There might be behaviors that are inherited that lead to anxiety. But I'm like, being anxious about going to a place you've never been and not ever being familiar with it is actually a pretty normal response to the place you're about to go. Like,
yes. But why is that so? Well, you just said something really interesting I have to jump in on. The chemical imbalance thing, which is still widely accepted as I'm depressed because of a chemical. And again, I take psych meds, disclaimer, I'm not anti-medication. Like do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. But ask a psychiatrist, what is a precisely balanced chemistry in someone's brain? How much serotonin to dopamine? How much of this the chemical imbalance theory has never been proven. In fact, it's been disproven.
Yeah.
Right. Not that chemistry doesn't play a role, but like, no, you're not depressed because of a chemical imbalance, but you can't, well, I just said it and other people have said it who have studied it and done quantitative meta-analyses on it. But yes, depression's a problem.
Well, it's a great metric to sell a drug that works on the chemical, the reuptake, that limits the reuptake of serotonin. So you have more circulating serotonin because the issue is serotonin.
In theory.
Not your life, not the choices, not the environment, not that you're still in a high conflict relationship, not that you still have a relationship with your highly dysfunctional, narcissistic, abusive mother. Like not that you are in a relationship where there's constant betrayal and you just stay in it, not where you're under the thumb of someone who makes the money and you don't feel autonomy, not where, not where you still have addiction issues, not where you're on your phone 24 fucking hours a day.
Right.
Like the the symptom can't be ignored. And really, like, why are we not? I mean, you and I are shouting right now, or I'm shouting and projecting, but it's like, why are we not shouting from the rooftops? Like, you're not the fucking problem. The problem is what's going on in your life, and maybe not even a problem, but it needs reorganization.
Which is not required as a therapist for me. If you come into my office as a client with every single thing you just said, all I have to do is open my DSM, check off your list of symptoms, not the context, not the origin, not the environment, not the contributing factors. Are you feeling sad? Has this persisted for a period of time or the next amount? If you check off enough of the symptoms, you now get the diagnosis. End scene. Now, hopefully now, I would hope more therapists that are getting trauma informed will have more of a dialogue about it, but it's still not required to have that dialogue, nor is trauma relevant to the diagnostic process, which is criminal to me in terms of that. Then it's not, you have depression as a functional adaptation to your life's shits. Your brain. Your brain is on your side. Your brain is always on your side. But like, you now have a disorder that now must be treated. So
you now have to not self-identify, but you now have an identity that you have a problem.
This is your problem.
You are a problem.
Right.
You inherited it, perhaps, depending on the therapist or the psychiatrist. You inherited it. And so there's actually nothing you can do about it.
Which goes in the face of neuroplasticity. It's
my God. Well, it also completely is in opposition of post-traumatic growth as a concept and a fairly well-researched area. You know, I remember learning that it's not actually the story of what happens in your life that matters. It's how you tell the story of what happens. You know, like, these moments, were they moments of transformation and resilience, or were they not? Can we look, which I think it becomes a skill set to be able to hold the seriousness of a circumstance and also begin to seed what can be cultivated from a circumstance.
Which you can't do without getting labeled a victim blamer. And again, I can use myself because I've been called
that. I think I have a recent comment on YouTube about it. Yeah. Well, that's why I always add that context, because it's important.
It is important, but I can say, as again, I've been trigger warning, which we can get onto those, but I'll just say it for here. I've been raped. I've been molested as a child. Like, I have all the things that would then qualify me to sit there and say it's not my fault. And those things weren't my fault. Nothing about those things was my contribution or my fault. And for me to identify as a disease then takes all my agency away from me, which then creates post-traumatic growth. I can't be resilient and pathologized in the same breath. So it can't be both. Right? It can be, yes,
but
terrible things.
Pathology can be the bridge to resilience.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a starting place. Yes. I'm fine with diagnostic labels as here's what you need to know about how to better manage yourself. But diagnosis and symptoms are not starting places. They're, let's unpack and let's set up shop and build a home and live forever in this identity.
You know, I have, I don't think I've shared this yet, but I've had a fairly large bone to pick with the mental health professionals who work with, and I say that because as much as I can speak up about something, I don't carry the same authority as a psychotherapist or someone who works in child development or something like that. And the bone I have to pick is the immense failure of that space with COVID and face masks and child development. Like, I look at that and I'm like, the APA actually removed information from their website when they made the claim that there is no evidence to support that wearing a mask inhibits the development of speech. Anyone who's watched the still face experiment knows that's the only one you have to watch. And you're like, well, that's fucking not true. But that's how kids learn empathy. That's how they learn language, is by watching faces. And I couldn't believe that after that claim was made, which is not, there is research, there is no research to show. So there's an absence of it, which is now evidence, apparently, when it's needed for convenience of politically motivated influence. And the face mask discussion about whether they work or not, there's plenty of evidence on both sides that will argue that they do or they don't, which makes it null anyways. But for children, I was like, man, why are people who are trained in this space not seeing what I think is very obvious? Like, it seems just obvious to me, but I also was not captured by the immense fear. Early in COVID, I was curious about it. I was like, what is the risk profile? Should I be afraid? What's my risk? I worked in pharma for 14 years. I had the ability to read the science, but I was like, this is a no-brainer.
It should be a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But that's true with a lot of the childhood developmental stuff that, again, has been way overblown to every discomfort or ailment in a child is now a trigger that is creating trauma that must be managed and soothed and preventing any sort of resilience. Like, our brains need stretches and they need to have resistance and they need friction and challenges. So now it's, and I had a kids practice where parents were like, well, I'm not a physician, so I can't prescribe, but they're like, this child needs medication. I'm like, but do they? And even asking that question would put me in a category that would label me as a very, very bad provider.
So you're not doing what the parent thinks is best, even though you're the therapeutic intervention they're seeking to help resolve.
Not necessarily what the parents think are best, but like, even daring to say depression is not a disease is such an inflammatory thing to say. And if I were to suggest to, and again, the parents aren't the problem. They're doing the best they can when they come in. But like, they're like, no, I was told that it's a chemical imbalance. My kiddo is clearly depressed. They need drugs and they need a label. Meanwhile, their brain is changing at such a rapid, I mean, puberty is insane for everybody. I think everyone who goes through adolescence.
Add zits to that, and you got wet dreams. They were great.
And random hairs and like.
Oh, random hair is a good call.
God, like weird stuff. Like, or is it, I don't like the word normal, but does it make sense in context? And often if we ask the question, does this make sense in context? We're going to get a resounding yes. But again, that requires
especially
nuance.
School and social pressures, and you add social media to that, which even adds more complexity to it. Yeah, it's when I look at the sort of like, because I feel like mental health and mental health professionals have really been put at the forefront of so much decision making and authority. But if the authoritative intervention, which I would say the majority of the people making those decisions come from academia and more research based, not necessarily always true, but a lot of people in those spaces are not actively, let's say in physicians, they're not actively seeing patients, they're in the policy space.
Correct. Or in the very controlled, I went to Duke for undergrad and I worked in a lab and I worked in a psych hospital on the adolescent unit. No one was talking about context or environment or like biopsychosocial contributors to this. It was you diagnose, which profits the system based on a model that's been updated 5 times total in its history.
How long has it been around?
I think the first DSM, I mean, the profession and the study of psychology is like time immemorial, but really the 50s and the 60s is still where a lot of these things originated, and the ideology is very much the same. Yeah,
you look back, and I think that's hard for people to like hold the truth that people in authority have done fucked up things and lied and also believed things that are not healthy or productive. Like, you look in the physician space but you don't have to look beyond thalidomide to see that. But there's been many pieces of evidence, lots of fines of pharma companies and also collusion with medicine. But then you even look in the psych space, the space of the chemical imbalance. And like, I look back at the 50s, I think it was it was in the 50s where, even in the Victorian age, when they made fucking cornflakes to reduce sexual desire. People don't realize that Kellogg was like very much like didn't want people to get boners or aroused. So he's like, cornflakes are boring. If we eat cornflakes, we won't want to have sex.
I don't even know how to follow that. That's like end drop mic and scene.
It's just fucked up.
But hysteria, and especially for women, like orgasms was a mental illness issue. Like, oh my God. And any type of anxiety and hysteria, all of these things.
Origin for women, right?
Exactly.
Is womb? Hyster? Yeah. Like hysterectomy?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I remember reading the research on sex education from the 50s that if the woman did not desire her husband, then she needed to go there was a problem with her that she had vaginal atrophy, not that the relationship wasn't safe and not one where she desired lubricating for.
Yes.
And that was like taught.
Yeah.
By the people doing the intervention who were very often women, which I don't say that to blame anybody, but just so that we have understanding that good people can do bad things and people who are trained in systems can. I was a farmer rep. I was a member of the army that went out and taught this. So I was captured by it. I remember going to our national meetings. And again, there's so many amazing people in that industry. I've had so many incredible mentors. It was transformative in the role it had in my life. I learned a lot. And I remember going to national meetings where they were like, hoorah, and they had like, you know, a theme, like resilience is this year's theme or whatever it was. And so everyone's name tag would have that. Everything would be like, it would be on every wall. But I say all that because like when I was in it, I remember when someone would be critical of the pharma industry, there was very much the response was people just don't understand us. Like covert narcissism. We're like, nah, people just don't understand that we're just trying to do good.
A religious cult, a pharmaceutical convention. Again, it's this mono-minded thinking that leaves no room for nuance. If we could embrace our multiplicity, there'd be space for, oops, guys, we got it wrong. Like, we're going to actually backtrack what we claimed now with updated science and better information. We're going to come forth and say this. But there's no room for that because if my entire identity is steeped in my academic reputation and my tenure is dependent upon publishing, I can't backtrack what I said. I have to double down on it no matter what.
Well, and if I feel like my intention in having conversations like this is to improve the whole area, you know, to be part of that, to also, you know, hold criticisms of how I've been or whatever that might be. But I have a theory that people who are in healthcare practicing roles, including the very industry I'm in, are actually prone to being captured by ideologies. And the reason I think that, and I would say, it's not even a thought, I think it's validated, is that because what makes someone a really good doctor, nurse, dietitian, coach, therapist, insert whatever, physio, almost always, not always, but almost always is due to the survival strategies that they developed as children, where they were highly attuned to other people or desired to help other people. And in some way, as a kid, that ideally was creating safety or the perception of safety or more safety. So as an adult, they naturally have a predilection towards that. And so they're highly skilled in it and now they've monetized it. And so they're getting paid to stay in their survival strategy. And so to me, that makes people in that space easily captured by an ideology because in order to challenge something like, let's say, face masks on kids don't work and we can get into the conversation about gender. If for me to challenge that, I have to now disappoint people. But the very framework of my survival strategy has been to minimize conflict and make sure everyone's better. I would argue that actually standing up against those things is the liberation from the trap that the monetization of someone's survival strategy becomes. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. None of which is available to you if you don't know that your brain is doing that. And so we are not taught the basic mechanics of our brain. Like I learned driver's ed when I was 16. I don't know how my entire car operates, but I know how to hit the gas, hit the brake. I know where the windshield wipers are. I know enough to safely-ish drive a car. We're not taught that with our brains. If you don't know that your brain has these adaptive survival strategies, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, I didn't even hear those terms until I was well into my specialized training, post-grad. And it was like...
It's wild because it's like present in every conflict.
In every single conflict, there's the presence of multiplicity and there is the presence of survival brain physiology.
Yeah.
Neither of which is ever uttered in the hallways of academia or in any classroom that I've ever seen. Maybe some specialty schools are. Inside Out 2 and Inside Out, I think, will help with the dialogue. But if you don't understand your multiplicity, then when you come at me, I'm going to fuse with all of my different parts and then I'm going to go into fight. But if I don't know that that's happening, how am I supposed to solve it? So it's really not about pointing fingers at like you're the problem or you're the problem. It's your brain's braining all the time. And if you've never gotten driver's ed, no wonder it's such a shit show.
Do you think that the brains function in people then who go into the more like service oriented roles is what makes if my theory stands, what makes them more prone to being captured by an ideology from a brain function perspective?
From a brain function perspective? Yeah. So people get into the helping profession for various reasons. Not all good.
Let's go.
One, they've worked with their shit. They have identified their stuff and they're committed to a process of healing. They've learned a few things. They have something to offer. Cool.
Yeah.
They are in anywhere ready to deal with their shit, and they want to avoid their shit by being helpful to other people. Then there's a third camp, which is they've had such wonderful, non-traumatic, healthy, happy lives. They just want to be helpful to other people. I fall more now into the first camp. But the second camp of I need to avoid by service. And again, people that default to more selfish, self-oriented, narcissistic would do well to go to the service-oriented side of the spectrum. But if you default to service in service of what's true for you about you, then you're going to be very susceptible, because that's a fawn response. That is a prolonged, sustained fawn response that, if it's challenged, will put you in a state of I must be accepted or die, which sounds extreme, but from a brain standpoint, that's what's happening.
It would appear to me as though things like cancel culture just further ingrain, like where there's no psychological safety and algorithms amplify division and perspectives. They feed us more of what affirms us.
Yes.
Right. And so then we are just like further rigidly encamped in our perspective. I wonder, because for me, I look at it from like not a brain function space, but from like more of that codependency pattern of behavior that then like for me to challenge something threatens my own self-identity and my safety. And then like, who am I if my colleagues or the place where I've found some security now is actually willing to get rid of me, which is speaking back to like the cult thing, the ideological space thing. Is that?
It's so interesting because the division that is actually necessary to create harmony is internal. Like we need more, I say this in the new book, wholeness ironically requires multiplicity. Like if I am separate enough in my psyche that I can allow for curiosity and nuance and debate and dialogue and constructive feedback and critical thinking, then I can show up in any room with curiosity and to be able to collaborate. But if I am profoundly smushed together with all of the parts of and if I'm fused into this one monolith identity, then any room I walk in, I'm walking in with an agenda, which is then supported by survival physiology, which is then going to promote confirmation bias and echo chamber thinking and mass divisiveness. But like we all need to divide our own psyche back into its parts. And I think that will go a long way in helping. Like I can come at my partner from a much less crazy bitch place when there's no crazy. I'm using that glibly. But like if I come at my partner from an awareness of I have a child part who feels rejected, I have a teen part who wants to cut your head off, I have a people pleaser part who wants to just say whatever you think, dear, and I have all of these different aspects, then I can speak on behalf of my parts instead of as my parts. I call it the who has the mic exercise. Are you speaking from the center, from the I, capital I, the center, or are you speaking from one of your parts? Because when your parts have the mic, things don't, all our parts are great. They all have a job to do. But when we're speaking as our feelings rather than on behalf of our feelings, there's no brain structure for logical thinking because we're in the back.
The frontal cortex is gone.
Yeah.
Which when we're inundated with all the rhetoric that is like, the news, all the stuff going on in the world. Like, how can we ever be in our prefrontal cortex?
Which is why we can't, which is why I like the questions as an immediate stopgap, no matter where you are, is who's profiting off of right now? Like, I'm looking at this, who's profiting off of this? And then what are my choices? Because it's not just, I'm a victim of people profiting off of my desire to belong and fit in. It's, I have choices here. So holding space for both. There's a system at play. What are my choices does a lot of jobs. And it's a hard question to ask because it takes away the blame, shame, point the finger, rescue fantasy thing.
When I look at complex areas of discussion. Let me trigger warning. Maybe we can actually first talk about trigger warnings and the productivity of trigger warnings. Like, from my understanding, the implementation of them actually creates more anxiety.
That's what the research says.
Yeah.
But they're also predicated upon the idea that triggers are bad. Triggers are not bad. All triggers are information.
Right.
If we never get triggered, how are we ever supposed to get an access path to our own soul and our own psyche? Like triggers are not, I'm not saying we should walk around bleeding out all day,
Right.
but why are we trying to prevent triggers? Triggers are not something bad. As if you punch me in the face, that's not a trigger, that's abuse.
Right.
But like if you turn on your music too loud and I start crying and melting down because I got triggered, cool. That's a pathway to something that really needs my attention. So trigger warnings, 1, don't work, and 2 are based on the idea that triggers are bad, and they're not. They're neutral things that call back to an injury. So like, yay, use them as roadmaps.
That's very counterculture.
I know.
I love it. I love it because I remember hearing, this is a triggering name, Jordan Peterson, say that triggers are an invitation to mastery. And I like, that's a good statement, right? You can hate him and love the quote. And when I look at the being inquisitive about our emotional response in a culture that has taught us that an emotional response to what someone says is because what they're saying is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
So get rid of them so you can maintain a state where no one causes you any emotional fluctuation.
Right. This is true in dating, especially in dating, right? Like I have an anxious attachment, so you have to text me every morning, good morning, beautiful, or I'm going to have a total meltdown.
I've heard where someone will say like, that's a reasonable request. Like you should meet that need. What do you think?
I think that's dependent upon the person. So I think that kind of compatibility might work. Like I'm not a texter. I really hate texting. Like I do not do my primary intimate relationship with my partner via text.
Yeah.
Fortunately, he's not a texter either. Like he goes overkill with picking up the phone and calling people, which I don't do that either. But if his attachment system was dependent upon all day text communication, it's not that he's wrong or I'm right. It's that we are fundamentally incompatible if neither of us is willing to explore and examine. But if he loved me, then he wouldn't make me text. It's like, well, if I loved him, I wouldn't refuse to text.
Right.
Who's right there? So trigger compatibility, I think, is a thing that doesn't get talked about.
Yeah.
Is so much more important than personality compatibility. But ultimately, my triggers are my responsibility. I can ask for reasonable accommodations, reasonable being defined by the person, but my triggers are not your job to manage. In fact, it does me a profound disrespect by outsourcing that control to you. That says my locus of control is no longer inside me to make changes and choices. It's you can now define my okayness. And that's the definition of codependency.
I could see that being, if someone was like, I need you to text me every morning. In a way, me not finding some middle ground, of course, but refusing to do it exactly how you need it is actually, as you're saying, it's like, it's not in service of your own growth. Like, what are you trying to source? And what does it mean that I send you a text every morning? And what happens if I miss one? Because I was too busy or I got caught up in work. Now is your well-being reliant on that?
It's
too fragile. That's eggshelly. That's annoying.
Exactly. And we're not talking about abuse and manipulation. We're talking about things like texting and calling. And relationships need to have this type of dialogue in the dating phase to know, like, are you a texter? Like, what are the things that are non-negotiables for you? If I'm rigidly attached to you must text me every morning or else I'm not okay, that's going to limit my pool of partners, all of whom I suspect are not very healthy. That would accommodate that.
Yeah, which would match perfectly with the behavior request.
Right.
I think we are now, though, in that culture, though, where it's like, if they don't. I remember watching a video that went viral where a woman was recording and she said, there's a thing going around that's like, if a man won't find a man who will, and it was like about all these different things. And then she's like, I told it to my brother and he said, if a woman doesn't find one who will, and she's like, didn't sound quite very good. And I'm like, it's really interesting how culturally we've framed that I saw this years ago, that it's really okay to absolutely assault men verbally. And I understand the desire to equalize the power differentials that have been exploited. And for the average 15-year-old boy who's watching the conversation that's happening online, his natural predilection will be to go to like an Andrew Tate because he's like, I want to be unapologetic about this. I'm not toxic. And then because he doesn't have access to these like sweeter parts of himself because it's not safe, he then will be drawn potentially to this type of dialogue.
And that goes back to being captured by ideology. That if a man won't find one who will, might be better phrased, if a man won't, ask yourself, does he have a point? Like, is there something here that I should maybe consider?
Am I being reasonable?
You know, am I looking to make my partner my parent? And again, I keep hearkening back to parts and multiplicity because often this thing that happens in dating culture of my triggers are your responsibility are a sign that inner child work is needed, not attachment work, not dating work, not communication and relational stuff. That's self-parenting. Like if adults can't be abandoned, like abandonment implies a danger if you leave. So like as an adult, if I am able to, if I have the capacity to take care of myself, if I won't physically die if you leave, adults can't be abandoned by that definition. So I have abandonment issues and you're abandoning me is not actually accurate.
That's interesting, but the word carries such a weight, right? And then it's your response. It's like if "I'll die without you" is thrown around, but it really is like I need you, and if I don't have you, I'm going to metaphorically or physically die, which puts so much pressure on the relationship. I know this is a very unnatural segue, but I'm curious when we look at ideology and the ability to do intervention and have a discussion where I see that really absent is in the space of gender, in the space of gender dysphoria. I've had a few people who are trans on the podcast, which I've had great discussions with. One on the introduction of like, what is it? Where, you know, what is a top surgery? What's a bottom surgery? I then had another one on who is actually quite critical of the movement and parts of it, the inability to discuss things like, let's say like teen biological boys and teen girls tantrums. And like these subjects that are obviously very inflammatory. You look at J.K. Rowling, and that's a good perspective there. But it's like having biological males in women's sports. All these types of things seem like we could have a very simple, logical conversation. But because if you have this conversation, you're instantly framed as transphobic. And what I don't understand is that it's way too simple of a binary where I can want what's best for every person, trans people, but not just trans people, all people. And so it's like, okay, how do we create power where there might have been less, right? And then I look at that in the context, which we don't have to get into, but I look at it in the context of like, okay, well, how do we still preserve what women need in the conversation about change rooms or sports? Now, when I look at children, and Canada is especially like, you're seeing a lot of change of like what the science truly has said about transitions and the impact on mental health. There's new research coming out on like suicide and all that kind of stuff. But I'm curious from your perspective in the space, in the therapeutic space, is the way that we're orienting to this conversation in service of the optimal mental health of the individuals who are challenged by this? Like I read recently that something like it was by generation, the percentage of people who identify as LGBTQT++, and pardon my ignorance for missing anything in there. But in like Gen X, which I'm like Gen Y, Gen X, somewhere in there, it's like 9%. And I get that it goes up as society becomes more acceptable. In the current generation, it's 22%. And I'm like, sure, people are all gender fluid, curious, all this stuff. But I'm like, are we actually just mainstreaming like mental health disorders without challenging some of the pathologies of them, which is not minimizing or negating or anything like that. So don't try to trap me. I'm not trappable. But I'm like, can we speak to the complexity of this? What do you think? And I want to just like acknowledge that you answering this question, I recognize that you are bravely entering a space very few therapists are willing to enter.
It's such a big conversation.
At all the nuance and small print.
I don't have time to put all of the disclaimers and the nuances in the small print, except to say they're there.
Yeah.
Like All people deserve dignity. All people deserve to be treated with respect. I can speak to, I'm like, how do I want to answer this in a way that allows me to persist in my career? Okay, here's what I'll say. I had a kids therapy practice for years at the beginning of my career. When COVID happened, I closed it down. So okay, here's how I'm going to answer this. I'm going to make something up. Let's say a 13-year-old girl comes to me. Her parents bring her to me for therapy because she is actively suicidal. When I take her history, I learn she has a history of being sexually abused by female babysitters over years of time. She has a history of being bullied by the girls in her all-girls school. She has list after list after list of trauma inflicted by women upon her. And what she comes to me for is, I no longer want to be a girl. I want to be a boy. If I even so much as deign to suggest maybe we should have a bigger conversation than this one area, I would be labeled a TERF. I would be canceled. I would lose my license and I would never work again. For just and if you look at
just contextualizing trauma,
for just even suggesting that, is there something besides that? Like, let's talk about this. Sure, we can. I think we should talk about all of the things.
Yeah.
But given your history, would it be a reasonable assumption to consider that perhaps a lifetime of trauma inflicted upon women might be contributing to this? Like, might we have a trauma conversation before we have a conversation about permanently identifying in one particular camp? I can't do that. Like, by licensure governance, I cannot do that.
Isn't that in opposition to good care?
You would think. But the DSM, which again is what therapists are supposed to use, if I were to look at the criteria for gender dysphoria, of course this girl is going to meet all of them. Of course. But giving a diagnosis does not require or even invite me to consider context or to say, is there a component here that also needs to be concurrently addressed? Like, you cannot have a trauma conversation without now it being spun. Well, Britt is saying that all people who are trans are traumatized. I'm not saying that.
Right.
I am not saying that. I'm speaking on this one particular specific case that I made up, but I've seen this instance. If that's true, that trauma is a factor for this person, isn't it doing them a disservice not to be allowed to even ask the question? But in the current climate, I am not allowed to ask that question at all. So I don't treat kids or teens anymore because I think we should be able to ask all the questions. Again, before making a decision that has permanent lifelong consequences, which I support. Like, everyone should do whatever they want.
Totally. I agree with you.
But I'm a trauma therapist. I am no longer performing gender affirming care if I ask the trauma question. And I have a problem with that.
Well, it just goes in the face of the idea of providing actual, like, where the solution of seeing you is actually to get clarity and arrive at some sort of peacefulness or liberation. And the idea is the transition will be the solution in the case you're talking about, when really perhaps it's actually, if we dealt with the potential core issues, that wouldn't present as a potential symptom that is gender dysphoria. It's interesting because if you look at any other diagnosis in the DSM, there's no other one where you're like, do more of that. But with this, we're like, there's no challenge. It's no longer even considered, I would argue, a mental health challenge. It just is.
And again, the argument that I've heard against what you just said is like, well, homosexuality used to be considered a mental disorder.
That's
and
a good point.
Clearly it's not. And that is a good point. So I'm not challenging whether or not being trans is a mental disorder, because I challenge the disorder paradigm in general for all of the things.
Yeah.
I'm not challenging that. I'm saying, can't we have a trauma conversation before we have another conversation? And the answer in the way the system is currently organized is no. Like, I am being a completely transphobic, exclusionary, biased, stigmatizing. What I'm supposed to do in that circumstance is she checks off all the criteria. I am now supposed to refer her to a medical provider for puberty blockers. That's the protocol, which again, I'm not saying that there are not trans children. I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm saying I hope in a nuanced way that if this one particular circumstance, which is not an isolated incident, prohibits me from having the trauma conversation. That seems to be a big disconnect. Like if we can't even ask the question, or the fact that going through puberty is just a shit show in general.
Especially for girls, like you go from having a non-sexualized body to having a sexualized body.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the fastest way to create safety?
Mm-hmm.
Become a boy.
Right.
And again, you and I are not saying there's not true pathways where this is authentic and legitimate.
Of course.
I would say even the exploration of it is required in order to heal what could sometimes be the pathology. But we're adding so many qualifiers to it where I'm like, but it's like, if the ultimate goal is optimal wellness,
Mm-hmm.
is affirming everything the path to that? I would argue no, because like the job of any interventionalist is to walk together and provide the tools for someone to walk towards what is true.
Exactly. And looking at the pathology aspect, the trauma, the circumstances, that's the pathology. Pathology is in the what happens, not in the inside us. I don't subscribe to the disease model at all.
Yeah.
But if we can't make room for curiosity, and that's true with everything, like that's true if you came to me and you're like, I'm an addict, I would say to you, okay, let's explore that. Is it possible that there's some other thing going on here? That's fine. But it's not fine in the instance of gender. Like you cannot have a nuanced conversation. It's very black and white. And that's unfortunate.
It's not in service of health. It's not in service of well-being. It's like whenever we eradicate the exploration of complexity, we create simplified systems that are not simple. So it's like the illusion.
Right. And I get it. Children are suffering. I'm not disputing that. That people who are bullied and harassed for their gender identity, like I'm not giving a solution. I'm not saying it's not a problem. And I'm certainly not saying like you are. Well, I'm going to keep reiterating this. Like, I'm not saying it's not real. Like someone could go through all of those traumas and then still decide they want to transit.
Yeah.
Okay. That's fine. But to take nuance out of the discussion is completely anathema to health. You cannot have growth without curiosity and wrestling with multiple possibilities and the reality of multiple contributing factors, all of which need to be able to be explored and asked about. But if we can't ask the questions, how are we supposed to be able to optimize wellness and health and agency?
When it's hard when you create like your license is on the line, then again, we have this sort of like what's going on in the spaces there is cancel culture within the professions.
Right.
Which is like we are politically too pressured. So we're just going to take the side of the political pressure because we can't stand up against it. And you see that in academia about so many things. And to me, like where academia might have been the place where we sought hard conversations, the modeling of curiosity and journalism. You saw journalism being the space for that. But now, like, you're very seldom going to find a conversation that's oppositional to most of the things. Like you're not going to find it oppositional on what I would argue are like more in Canada, you won't find any news that is critical of the vaccine. You won't find any news that's critical of the way that gender dysphoria is managed. And again, the criticism of it is not the rejection of it. And that's the trap that the ideological extremes have created is like, if you don't agree, you are the opposite then. And all the opposite things are bad.
Right.
They're all like the last thing a human wants to be because then now you don't have group membership. But even just adopting the complexity or the curiosity, the role of curiosity, just adopting that, now you must not be for the good of humanity.
Which
that's a trap, man.
I love what you said that like criticism does not equal rejection. Criticism is supposed to be about curiosity and inquiry and debate and dialogue. But like you don't have to look very far to see that debate no longer means, I think, what it intended to mean, which is a nuanced discussion of all sides of an argument, like with the mutual intention of coming to a shared humanity. Debate doesn't mean that anymore. And which is a bummer because again, if we could allow space for our own multiplicity, we could hold space for each other's multiple levels of reality. And I think things would go better. I just know for me, my life started working a lot better when I realized how diversified and multifaceted my mind was, which means yours is too.
Yeah.
And Dick Schwartz, who invented internal family systems, he's like, if we could all really like start to recognize our own multiplicity and see the system of parts in other people, we'd have so much more compassion. There would be so much more room for compassionate dialogue because we wouldn't be in survival physiology fighting to the death to support our positions so we're not shunned from the group.
In a perfect world.
Yay, Pixar, for
Yay,
being
Pixar.
the same voice in this discussion.
So what is our path out of this, Britt?
Solve the problem, Britt. What do
Thanks
we
for
do?
walking off the plank with me. What is the path to swimming to the shore? Is it these types of conversations? Is it, I mean, I guess that's part of it.
I think it's part of it.
Even in your profession, like what's the solution?
A great question is what's my role to myself and what's my role to the collective? Like as a psychotherapist, my lane isn't to do all the things. Like I can't be in every single lane of social injustice simultaneously. There's only so many hours I have and so much bandwidth. So my lane and my role exists in my capacity to do the good that I'm able to do. And that's external. And then what's my role in managing my own shit so I don't leak out onto you and onto everyone is the other piece. What's my role is a really great question because my role is going to be to do something on behalf of the collective. And it's going to be to do something on behalf of my own inner world. I think that's a good question. That can help.
Like that because it like there's something doable immediately in my sphere of influence. My locus of control becomes internal.
Yes.
That I'm curious when we start to go to like, what's my role? I think of how we all have to be aware that there can be a narcissism to activism, and there can be like the activism actually becomes like the modeling of the trauma triangle, where the person doing the activism is never the perpetrator, but always the victim or the savior.
And there's the cult ideology showing up in activism. I mean, it really does show up in everything. So what's my role inward will also help. Because if my role is I must convince you of my position and you're wrong and I'm right, that's going to be problematic.
Yeah.
If I go inside and I'm like, what's my role here? And like, what's contributing to this? And then what are my choices here? Or another good question for inquiry would be, what else might also be true about this? That would be a really useful thing in any field, whether it's activism or therapy or whatever. Like, is there something else that might be true about this? Because the answer is almost always yes.
I'm curious from a brain perspective, and just to close out, like I'm curious from a brain perspective, can one maintain curiosity and ideological flexibility and multiplicity flexibility while simultaneously spending a lot of time on social media?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, the answer is, I don't know. I'm not in everyone's brains. That's my I don't know the answer to that. I will say it depends on what you're doing on social media. Like, I'm not anti-social media. I think there's a lot of good and there's a lot of potential there for good. Like
people will find this via
exactly
social media.
So if I'm on social media, completely lost in a doom scrolling algorithm sending me more and more extreme divisive things, and I am in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, then no, I cannot be flexible and adaptive and in my frontal cortex. If I'm on social media from a curiosity orientation and people say to me, well, how am I supposed to know? It's like, I know when I'm on social media from a healthy place versus when I'm not. If you take a second and you sort of mindfully check in, it's not hard to know when you're not in a good place on social media.
Yeah, so true.
So, how's my body responding right now is a great precursor to before I insert an opinion or a comment or jump into this conversation. How's my body doing? Am I in fight or flight right now? Because that's not a great place to post or comment or share or do anything. So is social media a contributor to the survival physiology that causes all the problems? Yes. Is it impossible to both be on social media and maintain flexibility? No. But it does make it harder because I know I don't really sit in my prefrontal cortex when I'm on social media for too long. There's a window of choice where I'm still in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
And I know when my window is now closed and I'm going down rabbit holes that I didn't choose, that I'm sort of defaulting to because they're here and my brain likes
designed to
exactly, which we know.
Yeah, it's like if we still don't, if the automation is to pick up the phone and open the social media app or whatever, that we have to insert a break in the automation
Yes.
because then we're back in discernment.
Exactly. Choice is now available.
Choice is everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's the answer to everything.
Assuming you have it. Again, people who have no choices, that's a different discussion. Like that is not where my work focuses. Like if you have no choices, that's not stuckness. That's oppression. But assuming that you have access, relative safety, and choices, then and people will say, but addiction isn't a choice. I'm not saying whether it is or whether it's not. I'm saying given your list of choices is doing something in service of not doing the thing on your choice list. If so, it is now a choice. But choice is power.
That's beautiful. All right. Britt, we walked a lot of paths. You courageously walked with me. I'm so grateful for you. So grateful that we got to have this conversation. For the people listening, where can they find more of your work? Your book, I know, is available wherever books are sold. The audiobook's incredible. Everybody buy her book. It's incredible. Like if this was insightful to you, her book is a deep dive specifically in the area of like, how do you move through not allowing yourself to win? It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. So where can people find more of you?
On social media in fight or flight, often at Britt Frank.
We'll link it out. Your website.
Scienceofstuck.com.
Okay, perfect. We'll put all that in the show notes. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being so generous with your thoughts, your feelings, your soul, your wisdom. Appreciate you dearly.
Thank you so much.
And for you listening, watching, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more of these juicy episodes. Much love.